Okay, so Resident Evil Village is finally out and I've just finished it. I'm just going to come out and say that this is a very conflicting game for me, and I don't know how to properly feel about feeling this way. Because this is a very good game, and I have no doubt about that. Village does a lot of things right, and even some things better than any other Resident Evil game. For starters, combat and visuals are top tier in this franchise. Resident Evil has always been a great looking franchise, and Village is no exception to that. Gameplay is in the first person perspective, just like it was in 7, but it's been a bit more polished here. I haven't played 7 in a couple years, but from my memory, these feel very similar, but Village's focus on combat over horror has given way for better handling weapons with more recoil and feedback, more variety in combat with a more extensive equipment loadout, and more mass market appeal due to the higher frequency of combat encounters. As for atmosphere, the location from where the game is named has some genuinely great moments. The sense of someone watching you is constant while you explore the ruins of this village, as you hear the sounds of enemy footsteps around the next corner and atop the scattered rooftops. Additionally, there's a sequence in a dollhouse that I will not spoil as it was my favourite section in the entire game that matches the most horrifying and hair-raising moments of 7 and any other Resident Evil game for that matter. Chris Redfield and the Chunky Merchant are two standout characters, and I really enjoyed interacting with them throughout the campaign, even if those interactions were short. And that's basically my list of compliments I can give to Village without the need for any asterisks. But on the other side of this coin is all the stuff that I either did not like, or the stuff I enjoyed but felt disappointed with. The theme park horror design of Village, where the derelict town is a hub area of sorts connecting to the 4 different areas, will be a favourite for some people, or it will create a tonal dissonance for others, as there's little to no thematic connection between the gilded, towering castle of Dimitrescu and the fishing hamlet that looks like it was ripped straight out of Bloodborne's Old Hunter DLC. Back to combat, some will love the action focus and callbacks to Resident Evil 4, while others will want the horror focus of 7. I'm definitely in the middle of these points of contention, as I really enjoyed both the action rollercoaster of 4 and the horrific nature of 7. There's definitely a middle point that could have been struck here, but I think the whole experience is a bit too disconnected and therefore doesn't reach the lofty expectations the developers had for Village. Lastly are the things that I straight up did not enjoy and on a bad day would say I even hated. Ethan Winters is definitely the weakest protagonist in the entire RE franchise. He was bad in 7 and he's even worse here, but we'll discuss this in the next section. The villains are terribly handled with little screen time and a lack of personality. Lady Dimitrescu, also known as the Big Woman, is an interesting and compelling character, but she is such a minuscule part of this entire experience that the hype surrounding her baffles me. As for story, this game is a complete mess. It's a bit hard to make a story work when the leading character is garbage and the villains are shakily shoved into it, but Capcom managed to top themselves and create one of the worst stories I've played in a game in a very long time. And with that, I'm sure you can start to see how I'm conflicted. Village does so much right, and gives more of the same old Resident Evil gameplay loop which is always engaging and fun, but fumbles in its execution of tonal consistency, and downright slumps into Game of Thrones Season 8 quality of writing and story. As for spoilers, I'll be showing a number of areas, different weapons and enemy types, but I will not show any direct boss fights or story details after the first couple of hours. I'm going to talk about the story, characters and structure first, which is where most of my issues with Village lie, but I'll say this right now as to not give the wrong message. I am recommending this to you and definitely acknowledge that this is a very good game. So no matter how negative I end up sounding, the whole product is still worthy of your purchase. Three years after the hillbilly-filled adventures of 7, Ethan Winters and his wife Mia are living a quiet life somewhere in Europe with their newborn daughter Rose. After a cute night of storytelling and cooking, something pretty traumatic happens, and Rose is stolen away from the Winters. Ethan, hot on the trails of the kidnappers, follows them to a nearby Transylvania-inspired village. Armed with no knowledge, no weapons and no common sense at all,
Maybe they're out?
Ethan explores the village and meets up with the locals in order to find his daughter. The beginning starts off like every other Resident Evil. You have your basic pistol and a knife. Ammunition and items are scarce. You'll start off by exploring the surrounding environment, looking for more bullets, herbs to replenish your health, and scrap to craft ammunition. The way forward will be quite linear from the outset, as the village closely resembles a Metroidvania layout. You don't start off in the village and move through it once, jumping from one location to the next. Instead, you will explore it multiple times, with new sections, new houses, and new paths opening up as you clear out the 4 main paths connecting to the village. It's a pretty great thing then that Capcom created one of the best Resident Evil locations with the village. Exploring this area is a blast. There's a lot of hidden areas scattered around the place that you can easily miss. The reward for taking time and doing another pass through the village after acquiring a new key is satisfying, as you'll gain access to new weapons, upgrade material, and items. It also folds into itself quite nicely. It's not the most complex and interconnected area you'll ever explore in a game, but there is a nice amount of unlockable shortcuts around the village to help speed up your clear time. The map is also a big help, as it uses the orange and blue color coding system that I believe Resident Evil 2 Remake first introduced. This makes it so you're never wasting time looking in a house that you've already cleared out, and you will know exactly where your next destination will be when you're searching a new section of the village. When you progress far enough into the story and find the Fat Merchant, you will begin to find animals littered around the world, allowing you to hunt them and trade their meat to the merchant so he can cook you a meal which permanently buffs your stats. As for the paths connecting to the village, these can only be done in a linear fashion as far as I'm aware. The Metroidvania style progression is but one item that progressively gets more useful instead of multiple different unlockables. Lady Dimitrescu and her castle are first up, which takes you to the most obvious Resident Evil style location. It basically works the exact same as the police station in RE2 Remake or the Baker House in RE7. Not long after entering the castle, you'll be done there and ready to move onto a new side path and a new theme park inspired ride. Rinse and repeat this structure for about 8 hours, which is how long it took me to beat the campaign on standard difficulty. Just remember that Resident Evil games are designed to be beaten multiple times with the help of some very appealing New Game Plus options. Village is no exception to that, as it offers additional difficulties, challenges to complete, and unique weapons to unlock. Overall, I really enjoyed the structure of Village. The sense of exploring everything you can, and then getting a new key or item that lets you open up and see more of the village was always exciting. If you ever got tired of one particular area, you were always right around the corner of a new area and another chance to open up new parts of the village. It's just a shame then that in my entire playthrough, I spent maybe an hour and a half in the village. Although it's the central piece to all these branching roads and the name of the game, it does still feel small. Especially once you've got a visual map in your head and can move through the village in a matter of minutes. I really wish they had made this bigger, much bigger in fact, or at least made the village one of the villain's lairs. Nevertheless, the village is my favourite location in any Resident Evil game, and that's saying a lot when we've had the likes of the baker's house and the police station. Let's back up a little and continue talking about the shit sandwich of a story Village has. I call it a shit sandwich because you have Ethan Winters on one side, the villains on the other, and all the Resident Evil nonsense in the middle. I want to be completely transparent and acknowledge that Resident Evil has always been a campy horror, nonsensical filled franchise with some pretty poor voice acting at times.
You saved me!
Yeah.
That was close. Thanks, Barry.
But Resident Evil 7 brought a more self-serious tone, ditching most of the Umbrella Corporation stuff, and was much more interested in getting you to shit your pants rather than building a complex story that connects with the rest of the RE universe. So it's pretty disappointing that Village throws all that out the window and goes full campy B-movie schlock without the over-the-top characters to support it like Leon did in Resident Evil 4. Let's start with the root of this issue. The man with no face, Ethan Winters. He is such a fucking awful character. He does nothing interesting, he says nothing exciting, he has no personality, and this doubles with his voice actor since it feels like he's not even trying. There's a scene at the beginning where his wife Mia is yelling at him and selling some emotion, and Ethan is completely monotone in the corner, telling her to calm down. I just wanted Mia to turn around and say, "No, Ethan, can you please show some fucking emotion?"
Is there something you're not telling me? Come on, talk to me.
Ethan Winters is also basically a superhero at this point, which is really awkward since he's meant to be selling the regular guy motif. You don't write a story this ridiculous and over the top and not use Chris Redfield as the main character unless you're trying to portray a regular person. Resident Evil 7 had a scene early on where Ethan gets his hand cut off, and to fix this it simply gets stapled back on. Well, if you thought that was far-fetched, then buckle up for Village, since that's the least of his problems. Every 30 minutes, Ethan gets a new part of his body ripped off, or cut off, or bitten off, and all he does is pour a healing elixir on the wounded body part and goes on his merry way. He also barely reacts whenever a new part of his body gets cut off, which really does not sell the horrific nature of these events at all. Like, I know he went through all the shit he did in 7, but he's still just a guy, and this shit barely phases him. Back to the part where he gets injured. There's a scene where Lady Dimitrescu's daughters stab sickles into Ethan's calves and then impale his hands and hoist him up. To get out of this predicament, Ethan rips his hands down to unimpale himself. He finds a nearby elixir and pours it onto his hands and then leaves, but he doesn't do anything to his legs, and he never brings it up again or reacts to the 2 massive holes he would have in his calves. If you think all that can simply be explained by healing elixirs doing their job properly, as they heal you from all sorts of wounds in the gameplay, so why shouldn't they be able to do the same in cutscenes, then I'm happy for you, and admittedly I can follow the same view. But then shit like this happens. Ethan falls multiple stories and just gets up and walks away. Even Kratos in God of War shows more emotion and exhaustion from just being punched. Ethan getting hurt as much as he does and never having any consequences really hurts the narrative, as I just stopped caring about what could happen to him, as I knew he was always going to be fine. And when a horror game fails to keep you engaged and scared during the cutscenes, it really hurts the overall impact of the experience, because whenever a cutscene starts, my immersion is broken, the tension is lost, and I'm no longer scared. After watching the trailers, you wouldn't be mistaken for thinking this would be Ethan Winters versus Lady Dimitrescu, the game. Well, unfortunately, you couldn't be more wrong. Lady D is in the game for maybe 1 hour. She is such a small part of this story, and that's a real shame because she's one of the 2 decent villains Village has to offer. Besides Lady D having a fantastic unique design, being pretty thick and having all but one goal, to eat you, she doesn't offer anything as original in terms of gameplay. Her entire section is the exact same to a T as Mr. X in the police station or Jack in the beginning of RE7. But she's a lot less hostile, like I only ran into her once or twice while exploring the castle. She just felt a little underwhelming and underutilized. The other decent villain is Heisenberg, who is basically a metal bender from the Legend of Korra. I won't speak much on him as he comes into the game quite late, but I will say it looked like the story was going to go one way with him, except they didn't end up doing anything interesting with him, just like the others. And lastly, you have the meat and potatoes of the story, which is topped off by a final boss fight from a villain you never actually meet until the last few minutes. I'm going to keep this brief because I'm already sick of talking about the story and characters. Firstly, there are so many plot holes and inconsistencies in the story. Chris Redfield has some type of involvement here, and this whole series of events would not happen if he just told the truth. He's just being a dick about the whole situation. Then there's the inconsistencies like Ethan's leg that I brought up earlier. The first time you encounter a lichen, you get pulled down under the floorboards of the house and then get thrown out of the house through a brick wall. When you go back inside and explore the house, the hole in the floor isn't there anymore. It's these little inconsistencies that don't kill a story, but do start to show the cracks in it. Then there's all the stuff to do with Umbrella and the T-Virus, which is just nonsense, and they felt the need to connect this to so many other Resident Evil games, which just didn't do anything for me. If you're just looking for some dumb fun, something that doesn't take itself too seriously, then this is your game and you'll get great satisfaction out of the story here. But after the serious tone of RE7, and seeing how well Capcom handled that, this definitely left an unsatisfying taste in my mouth. Gameplay in Resident Evil Village can be summed up by saying it's more of the same, which is a good thing, don't get me wrong, but it won't blow anyone away. The first half, or the first 2 areas after the initial village visit, are what I'd call proper Resident Evil survival horror. There's some action, but not too much. Ammunition and items are limited. Enemies are scattered around the map sparingly, and the areas you explore are quite narrow and claustrophobic. After the incredible dollhouse sequence, which I would say is the midpoint of the game, the action quickly gets ratcheted up and continues until Village resembles Call of Duty closer than it does Resident Evil. Ammunition is overflowing in your inventory, pipe bombs and landmines are plentiful. areas become wider and more crowded with enemies. A few areas also throw horde-style battles at you, pushing right into Resident Evil 5 or 6 territory, while having all of the nuance of a Michael Bay movie. It's these sections in particular and all the bells and whistles of gameplay that make this a spiritual successor to Resident Evil 4. Although it keeps the first-person perspective of 7 and the same casting characters, it basically is Resident Evil 4.5. Item and ammunition economy, inventory space and weaponry are all 1-for-1 with RE4, and it's topped off with the addition of the Duke, who fills the same role as the Merchant. He will pop up in multiple areas around the map, allowing you to level up your weapons, buy and sell items, and cook you meals. Gunplay in Village is absolutely awful in the beginning, and this is thanks to aim acceleration being on by default. Once you realize that that's a thing the developers did and turn it off in the options menu, gunplay begins to feel great and you can actually aim properly. The weapons here feel meaty and hit with a punch, especially the shotguns and Magnum. You'll get no shortage of enjoyment out of aiming your shotgun at an enemy's head and watching it explode like a watermelon. Guns also have a good amount of recoil to them, lending the feeling of power, which makes you wait between each shot as bullets are quite precious in the beginning. Adding to the recoil are the enemies who duck, bob and weave while you're aiming at them, causing them to become harder targets to hit. This forces you to be patient with your shots, otherwise you'll quickly run out of ammo and the enemies will be unharmed and ready to take a bite out of your jugular. Enemies here are also quite spongy. You'll either really like this as it gives you more time with the guns, or you'll wish they were easier to take down, like I did. But if this was the case, they would need to scale back the amount of ammunition, and before you know it, this would be a horror game instead of an action game. There really isn't a great amount of enemy variety. You have your humanoid enemy, your reskinned humanoid enemy, your big humanoid enemy. There's like one type of quadruped beast enemy, and one type of flying enemy. It's not a lot, but it's definitely better than 7. Lastly, you have some puzzles to solve and a few bosses to kill, which I won't spoil because there aren't a lot of these in the game, but they're your average RE content. There's really not a whole lot to say on gameplay, as it's your standard Resident Evil gameplay loop. It hasn't changed much over the years, and that's not a bad thing, because it's really fun to kill enemies, loot around, and upgrade your character. If you enjoy the gameplay of other RE games, then you'll get great satisfaction out of this one, because it's probably the most polished and well-rounded. The biggest problem with Resident Evil Village isn't the generic story or the dreadful Ethan Winters, or that Lady Dimitrescu is in the game for the best part of an hour. No, I'd say my biggest problem with Resident Evil Village, and I don't know if this is even a negative or not, so I'll just call it a disappointment. My biggest disappointment is that Resident Evil Village just feels like another Resident Evil game, and that might be great for some, but I wanted a little bit more. A little bit more uniqueness, and a little bit more creativity. It's funny, I haven't felt this way about a game since Dark Souls 3, and there's a few similarities here. In the last few years we have played a lot of Resident Evil. 2017 gave us Resi 7, 2019 Resident Evil 2 Remake, 2020 followed that with Resident Evil 3 Remake, and now in 2021 we have Resident Evil Village, and ultimately they're all very similar, even with the difference in gameplay perspective. The reason I brought up Dark Souls 3 is because when that game came out, it was the third Soulsborne game in 2 years, and it felt like just another installment in that franchise, feeling almost like the exact middle point between Dark Souls 1 and Bloodborne. And now likewise with Resident Evil Village, it feels like the exact same middle point, but it's between Resident Evil 4 and Resident Evil 7. I will say again, this might be perfect for some, especially people who loved 4 and thought 7 was too scary or too survival horror based. But this game is in an awkward position for me because 4 and 7 are my two favourites in the franchise, but I love them for very different reasons. See, 4 was this balls to the wall, crazy action game with a B-movie motif running through its veins. It didn't take itself too seriously. It was a roller coaster and it wanted nothing more than to get you in that seat and go on its wild ride. Whereas 7 was dark, disturbing, and disgusting. The Baker family was the central theme throughout that game, and they perfectly encapsulated everything it was trying to achieve. Bringing in a first-person perspective also gave the franchise a breath of fresh air. And now there's Resident Evil Village, which keeps the first-person perspective and tries to emulate the rollercoaster ride of 4, but something just doesn't fit as well as those two games did. I'm not sure if it's the story taking itself too seriously, while being campy over-the-top nonsense that hurts the game, or first-person not feeling as good to play as third-person in an action sense. All I know is Resident Evil Village just feels like another game in the franchise, and the reason this is disappointing right now is when I had the same feeling with Dark Souls 3, it didn't last for long. As replaying Dark Souls 3 months after release, when I had no expectations, made me love that game and view it as one of the best Soulsborne titles. And I'm almost positive that same thing will happen with Resident Evil Village.